1940 to 1941 was a period when the world hung by a thread. Europe was burning, Britain was fighting alone, the USSR had not yet declared itself an ally until Hitler invaded in June 1941, and Japan was growing in the Pacific. In Washington, the White House and Congress, an internal struggle was raging between isolationists who wanted to keep the country out of the war at any cost, and those who understood that if Britain fell, the United States would have no barrier to resurgent global expansion. Aid to British and other Allied forces began, seemingly, with small steps. Permission to buy and export goods for cash. But the steps escalated from cash and carry to destroyers for bases, and then to the program that fundamentally changed the U.S. role in the war, Lend-Lease. When war descended on the continent in September 1939, the United States officially declared neutrality. But American neutrality proved more than just an empty declaration. It was a complex, pragmatic balance. President Franklin Roosevelt understood that Britain alone could not endure a long war without goods, fuel, and transport. Therefore, as early as the fall of 1939, the cash and carry principle emerged, purchasing weapons and other goods from the United States under one condition: pay in cash and transport the aircraft or ships yourself. This allowed trade to continue without directly involving American ships or violating the literal nature of existing neutrality laws. Cash and carry became the first real instrument of assistance, gently shifting the line of neutrality toward practical support. This policy was important. It saved Britain from an immediate shortage of military materials, but at the same time highlighted the economic burden. Not everyone could afford to pay for everything up front and transport it on their own ships. For London, this was a temporary solution, but time and resources were quickly running out. After the fall of France and facing the grave threat of the Battle of the Atlantic and U-boat attacks, Britain desperately needed escort ships. The United States, still officially neutral, found a diplomatically elegant solution. On September 2, 1940, Franklin Roosevelt agreed to the Destroyers for Bases Agreement, an exchange of 50 aging American destroyers for leasehold rights to British bases in the Atlantic and Caribbean. It was a shrewd move. The United States strengthened the British fleet and helped protect convoys, but did so without a formal declaration of war and, crucially, bypassed a direct congressional vote by using an executive agreement. The destroyers, though obsolete, proved useful for convoys. Their fast, maneuverable hulls were well suited to searching for and pursuing submarines. For Britain, this literally inspired a new escort force. For the United States, this was a symbol of how far one could go to provide aid while remaining a non-belligerent power. Alongside the exchanges in cash and carry, there was a huge economic stimulus. American industry was emerging from the Great Depression and was ready for large-scale production. Roosevelt and his entourage understood that the U.S. economic recovery could and should culminate in large-scale military production, if not for the American front immediately, then for its future allies. Automotive, aircraft, and shipbuilding factories began working to meet orders from Britain and other countries. In financial terms, Washington sought ways to make aid sustainable and large-scale. This stage is also important because it paved the way for Lend-Lease. When it became clear that Britain was suffering not only combat losses, but also economic collapse from continuous purchases, the political decision to provide more generous aid began to look not only like a humanitarian gesture, but also an investment in the United States' own security. By early 1941, it became clear that cash and carry and barter were too little. Britain was depleting its foreign exchange reserves and could no longer pay for everything. Roosevelt proposed a program that would allow vital materials to be supplied on loan or loan. Partner countries could use the equipment and return it after the war or pay for it later. The idea met with fierce resistance in Congress. Many legislators feared it would drag the United States into conflict or create a trade debt for centuries. Nevertheless, the administration's arguments were compelling. Supporting Britain was protecting the United States. After heated debate, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act, and the President signed it on March 11, 1941. The law gave the executive branch the authority to supply arms, equipment, and materiel to any country vital to the defense of the United States. This was a legal translation key. American aid became massive, systemic, and far more than just buying and selling. Lend-Lease was not a gift in the traditional sense. Formally, the equipment was issued for use, but in practice, a significant portion was used and destroyed. And the economic benefits and political influence of the United States after the war became enormous. By the end of the program through 1945, the United States had supplied the Allies with approximately $50.1 billion in material aid. Of this, Great Britain received approximately $31.4 billion, and the USSR approximately $11.3 billion. These sums changed the balance of power at the front. The operation of Lend-Lease, roads, convoys, routes. The program could not operate in a vacuum. Supply is movement. Ships, trains, warehouses. American supplies traveled along three main routes to the USSR, through the Arctic, convoys to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, through the Persian corridor, via Iranian ports and railways, and across the Pacific Ocean, with restrictions after Japan's entry into the war. Each route had its risks. The Arctic was under threat from German submarines and naval forces. Persia required diplomatic and logistical cooperation. The Pacific Ocean, after December 1941, became virtually closed to American vessels heading toward the Soviet Union. American naval and air support was also a key component. Even before the official declaration of war, U.S. troops and ships began patrolling the Atlantic, providing escorts, and engaging in isolated conflicts with German submarines. Incidents with the USS Kearney and other ships in 1941. This was the path from neutrality to actual intervention, at first indirect, then increasingly overt. Lend-Lease in the USSR, from mistrust to the greatest aid. When Germany struck the USSR on June 22, 1941, the political logic changed instantly. Roosevelt and his team understood that the defeat of the USSR was a gain for Hitler and a direct threat to the United States. Despite ideological differences with Moscow, Washington began supplying the USSR with everything it could: trucks and cars, thousands of Dodge and Studebakers, aircraft, spare parts, food and fuel. Lend-Lease deliveries to the USSR were enormous, a material value of approximately $11.3 billion, thousands of trucks, a key factor in the Red Army's mobility, and millions of tons of food and fuel. These deliveries via the Arctic, Persia, and the Pacific Ocean helped maintain vast fronts and provide Soviet industry with raw materials. It is important to understand, Soviet historians and Western researchers debate the role of Lend-Lease in the victory over Nazism. However, the fact remains that U.S. aid dramatically strengthened the logistical capabilities of the USSR and its allies during critical periods of the war. Lend-Lease passed Congress with difficulty. Isolationists appealed to post-World War I fatigue, the danger of debt, and the moral hazards of being drawn into someone else's war. But the interventionist group, Roosevelt, some Republicans and business elites, insisted on "we help today or we fight tomorrow." The victory of the aid argument pushed American industry into war production mode, created jobs, and effectively accelerated the country's economic recovery. This became one of the paradoxical side effects of the policy. Around the spring and fall of 1941, American ships increasingly became involved in convoy protection, from patrolling neutral waters to escorting ships on routes where German U-boats were already operating. In September and October 1941, clashes occurred. The destroyer USS Kearney was hit by a torpedo in October. Later, the USS Reuben James was sunk, October 31, 1941. These incidents served as a crucial moral signal. The United States could no longer remain completely on the sidelines. Joint actions with the British Navy and the exchange of information made aid even more pragmatic and combat-ready. Under Lend-Lease, the United States shipped over $50 billion to the Allies, equivalent to 1941 to 1945. These funds provided millions of tons of food, tens of thousands of aircraft and vehicles, and thousands of tanks and artillery systems. For Britain, this was the lifeline that allowed it to survive. For the USSR, it was an opportunity to maintain the mobilization rhythm and increase the mobility of the army. For China, it was vital support in the war against Japan. The U.S. economic might truly become a factory of democracy, transforming itself into a vital source of arms and logistics for those fighting the Axis. Lend-Lease didn't decide the war on its own. It took soldiers, battles, intellect, politics, and fate. But it gave the Allies what they sorely lacked: equipment, fuel, transport, and raw materials. This was an invisible army: factories, docks, shipping lanes, railroads, and warehouses operating 24/7. For the U.S., this represented a transition from selective aid to a complete systemic mobilization of the economy and diplomacy. From a policy of "we don't want to fight" to a policy of "we won't let others lose." American aid to the Allies in 1939 to 1941 was crucial, as was an understanding of how foreign policy can evolve under the pressure of reality. From cash and carry to destroyers for bases and on to Lend-Lease, each stage reflected a compromise between domestic fears and external threats. These historic actions demonstrate how economics and diplomacy became key instruments of war, how lazily and cautiously the program was born that would later become the engine against the anti-Hitler coalition.